Hey, everybody, and welcome to another episode of True Consequences podcast. I'm your host, Eric Carter-Landin, and today we're going to be talking about one of the oldest serial killers in New Mexico history. But before we get into that, I need to give a shout out to Jackie Moranty, who has helped research and write this case. Originally, I did this case at the True Crime Podcast Festival using Spotify Live. However, the audio recording wasn't great, so I'm redoing it, and I'm including a video because I know you YouTube watchers have not had a video in a couple of weeks. I apologize for that. Hopefully we can get back into the groove of things. All right, let's get into it. Elizabethtown sits in the Moreno Valley between Taos and Cimarron, New Mexico, in the shadow of the imposing Mount Baldy. It was New Mexico's first incorporated town and was also the first Colfax County seat. Captain William H. Moore founded the town after finding the area rich in gold and copper in 1866. Moore tried to keep this find a secret, but just like any other town in New Mexico, word got out really fast. And by 1867, men began to pour into the area to find their fortunes in the gold trade. After making his fortune in copper ore, Captain Moore eventually opened a general store to supply those who were passing through the territory to find gold. Cabins began to sprout up, and the general store became the center of town. The following year, Moore joined other businessmen in the area and platted out the town site. They incorporated the village and began selling lots of land to newcomers who wanted to settle in the area. He sold the lots for anywhere between $800 and $1,200. Today, that would be anywhere between $13,559 and $20,338. He named the town after his daughter, Elizabeth Catherine Moore, who was 4 years old at the time. The town was eventually nicknamed E-Town by most of the locals. By the end of 1868, there were about 400 people living in E-Town. There was a sawmill and several stores, along with saloons and gambling houses. Soon E-Town grew. Settlers from Texas brought cattle with them, making the town fairly self-sufficient, and the rich soil of the valley was perfect for growing wheat and corn. The nightlife was a major attraction, with saloons boasting dance floors, gaming tables, and bars that were 100 feet long. As in any Old West town, sex work could be found in abundance in the red light district. The women were housed in cabins on the outskirts of town, and on the second floor of the ornate Mutt's Hotel, they would call down from windows with offers for the men passing by. Famous gamblers and outlaws traveled through town on their way to and from other places. Names like Wyatt Earp, Blackjack Ketchum, and Billy the Kid were known to spend a night gambling and drinking in E-Town. Other famous outlaws called Elizabethtown home, the likes of Coal Oil Jimmy Buckley and Clay Allison, who owned a ranch near town and will become a major player in our story. By 1869, a schoolhouse and a Protestant church were needed for the less raucous families that had settled in the valley and made Elizabethtown their home. Very soon after, a Catholic parish was also built. By 1870, Elizabethtown was home to 7,000 residents. There were 7 saloons, 3 dance halls, 5 stores, a school, 2 churches, and 1 serial killer. Born in 1839, Charles Kennedy was a large, husky man with wary, darting eyes, a full beard, and a very bad attitude. He married a Ute woman named Rosa and had 3 children with her. The family moved to the Moreno Valley sometime around 1865, where they built a traveler's rest stop in an isolated area at the base of Palo Flechado Pass. This rest stop sat on the road between Elizabethtown and Taos. The Kennedys offered their guests a home-cooked meal and maybe a little whiskey and a bed for the night. The cabin was conveniently located midway between Taos and E-Town. Weary travelers who were just too tired or cold enough that they couldn't make the 19-mile trek to Elizabethtown or the 24 miles to Taos, depending on what direction they were headed, would often stop at the Traveler's Rest. These men would register at the rest stop, and most would never be seen again. Many of these men were never missed in the transient era of gold mining. People came and went, and there were several hazards that could lead a man to his death. Apaches were known to travel through the area, causing mayhem and killing travelers for their possessions. There were also hazards of the road. There were bears, cougars, wolves, and sometimes people just disappeared. Mr. Edwards, whose first name has been lost to time, was one of Charles Kennedy's final victims. He was a successful businessman from Taos. He rode a good horse, used pack mules to carry his belongings, and carried hundreds of dollars in his pockets. Mr. Edwards was traveling to Taos on business and had stopped to water his horses at a spring not far from Kennedy's cabin. A sign welcomed travelers and offered rooms for rent. Edwards noticed that the cabin was in disrepair, with the walls beginning to cave in around the chimney that leaked smoke. But the sun was setting and he was tired from a long journey from Taos. Edwards decided to see if he could get a room for the night and some food. He was never seen alive again. Edwards would be missed by his family and his business partners, and a search party would be sent out to look for him. His body would be found later that fall near the cabin. He had been robbed and shot. Kennedy was questioned about his death and told the search party that Edwards had been shot by local Apaches. The searchers suspected that Kennedy was the killer, but they had no proof. Kennedy remained a free man for a few more months. Charles was a mean man, and he kept Rosa under lock and key by threatening to kill her remaining child. He had gone into fits of rage and killed the two older children before they moved to the area. So Rosa was determined to keep the secrets and stay subservient to keep her only child alive. Charles was said to have killed at least 14 people at the rest stop. He would lure them in, offer them food and drink, and while they were eating, he would either shoot them or kill them with an axe. He would then take all of their possessions and throw their bodies into the cellar until they could be buried or burned at his convenience. It was rumored that he also ate some of his victims, but there's really no way to confirm that. Kennedy had chosen the spot for his cabin with murder in mind. The area's only two roads merged at this very spot, so the opportunistic Kennedy would have plenty of victims, and he didn't have to look for them. They would all come to him. On a cold night in the fall of 1870, another traveler stopped in at the rest stop. He was offered food and drink as usual, but he felt uncomfortable. Kennedy was sullen and inhospitable. His wife, Rosa, never said a word, and it was apparent that Kennedy kept her as a slave to his whims. After he had been served supper, the man asked if there were any Indians in the country that he needed to watch out for. Charles's son, who was about 3 or 4 years old, said, "Can't you smell that one paw through in the cellar?" Charles immediately went into a rage. He shot the man and bashed his son's head against the fireplace. He beat Rosa severely and then drank himself into a stupor. Rosa waited for Charles to pass out, and then she left the cabin and made her way to Elizabethtown, 19 miles away. Now that all her children had been murdered by their father, there was no reason to keep his secrets any longer. It was a very cold, late September night, and Rosa was on foot. She was sure that Kennedy would track her down and kill her, just as he had killed her children. The terrified, bloody, beaten woman made it to John Pearson's saloon, where the infamous gunman Clay Allison was drinking with Davy Crockett, the nephew of the frontiersman by the same name who died at the Alamo. Upon seeing the hysterical woman, they offered her a chair and a bit of brandy to calm her nerves. At first, they couldn't believe what she was saying as she told the men the entire story of how Charles killed the traveler and her son. Rosa was in hysterics while telling the men that her husband had been luring travelers into their rest stop for years. and that he had killed as many as 14, maybe more. Some historians think that maybe he killed over 100 people. But again, there's really no way to prove that. She told them that she had waited for Kennedy to fall asleep that night, then climbed up the chimney to escape since he had locked her in the cabin and wouldn't let her leave. Clay Allison, if you remember, was a local rancher. He was known to have a short fuse and a quick trigger finger. He always seemed to be around when some acts of violence were happening and was more than happy to get in the middle of it. It was Allison that led the group of men to the rest stop and found Kennedy still drunk and sleeping it off. They arrested him and brought him back to Elizabethtown. Another group was sent to search the property for evidence of the murders, and they found it. Several human bones were found burning in a fire. There were 2 skeletons in the cellar beneath the house, and another skull would be found in the garden a few days later. Other witnesses began to come forward to tell their stories of Kennedy's murderous quests. One testified that he had been present when Kennedy shot one of the travelers. Kennedy was given a pretrial hearing on October 3, 1870, where this witness told his story. Rosa was not allowed to testify against her husband, but her story was well known by then. According to an article in the Daily New Mexican dated October 13, 1870, a man named Jose Cortez testified that he was at the Kennedy residence on Christmas the year before when he saw Kennedy shoot a man with a pistol. Cortez is quoted as saying the following: "A stranger came to the house afoot and stopped for the night. He was an American, had large red whiskers, and both of us had gone to bed, and I was asleep when the pistol shot awakened me. There was no light in the room, but Kennedy lit a candle, and I saw the stranger lying dead on the bed with a bullet hole through the head. I knew Kennedy killed the man because there was no one else in the house but Kennedy, his wife, the stranger, and me. After I refused to help Kennedy bury the man, I ran away to Taos, but I did not tell anyone what happened." The following is a summary of the story that was printed in the New Mexican on October 13, 1870. A number of bones had been found in Kennedy's garden, and the bones were brought into court for examination. Dr. Westerling and Dr. Bradford both looked at the bones, but they could not say for sure whether they were human. A few days later, a man who was a member of the Taos Pueblo went to Elizabethtown to report that he had found another human skeleton under the floor of one of the rooms in the Kennedy house. Justice McBride immediately went to the Kennedy Ranch and held an inquest on the remains. The jury then decided that the unknown victim had been killed by Charles Kennedy. The skull of the skeleton had holes in it consistent with an entry and exit wound from the bullet. At his pretrial hearing, Kennedy selected a jury of 12 people from a pool of 25 men. I think it's pretty strange that he chose his own jury. Maybe that's the way it was done in the Old West, but that's how the newspaper reported it. The jury failed to agree that Kennedy had murdered anyone since the bones found on the property couldn't positively be identified as human. The court ordered Kennedy to stand trial before a grand jury, and the judge ordered that he remain in custody until his trial, which was set for the following month. The townspeople weren't taking any chances. They were concerned that if the bones couldn't be identified as human, Kennedy would walk. Kennedy was being held in a log cabin because the jail wasn't secure enough to hold violent offenders. He was in shackles the entire time and under the watch of 2 armed guards around the clock. Around 11 o'clock, the night of October 7th, several men came into the cabin. The New Mexican newspaper article said that they were armed and in disguise. They surprised the guard and broke Kennedy out of jail. Now, this is where legend and truth intersect. There are several stories that surround the death of Charles Kennedy. The only thing we know for sure is that he was definitely attacked by Clay Allison and several other residents of Elizabethtown. According to the New Mexican, the men took Kennedy to an old abandoned slaughterhouse where they hung him from the rafters. The following morning, James McBride summoned a coroner's jury after the body was discovered by one of the townsfolk. The jury came to the conclusion that Kennedy had been killed by hanging at the hands of parties unknown. The local paper, The Telegraph, was quoted as saying the following: "So ended the life of this cold-blooded assassin. No doubt if the truth were known, the crime which was brought to light is but one of many he has perpetrated. There is a general feeling of satisfaction that he is at last beyond the power of doing further harm. Still, we have no word of pity for the murderer. We cannot commend the action of those who hung him. The time has passed when it was necessary for the people of this community to take the punishment of offenders into their own hands. We have laws that will give justice to all, and we have faithful and efficient officers to execute them. And it is time the citizens of the place should realize that vengeance is not justice, or a midnight mob the proper guardian of public safety." End quote. No one was ever arrested or tried in the death of Charles Kennedy, but the townspeople breathed a sigh of relief that he was gone. He'd been suspected of killing people at his ranch for many years, but no one could ever prove it. And though the papers would claim that the men who killed Kennedy were unknown, the residents of E-Town certainly knew who put Charles Kennedy in his grave, and not a jury in the world would likely convict any of them. Several New Mexican historians, including Benji Joe Fulton, who was once the curator of the E-Town Museum, cite documentation that the circumstances surrounding Kennedy's death were a bit different. The story is told something like this: the court ordered that Kennedy be held for action by the grand jury, but rumors started floating around that Kennedy's lawyer was going to try to bribe the grand jury into setting Kennedy free. Kennedy had been involved in several lawsuits and other legal actions and had managed to win all of them with the help of this lawyer. Clay Allison was not having any of that, and 3 days later, he and several others broke him out of jail, put a rope around his neck, tied the other end of the rope to a horse, and dragged Kennedy through the town by his neck until long after he was dead. The townspeople would not allow him to be buried in the Catholic cemetery in town, so he was buried outside of the boundaries of the cemetery. His gravestone read, quote, "Came to his death by hanging at the hands of parties unknown." The stories get even more strange when Kennedy's remains are discussed, though. One story is that Clay Allison decapitated him with a knife after he was dragged through the streets. Another is that he was dragged until he was decapitated. If the newspaper account is true, then he may have been decapitated after a botched hanging. That was a common occurrence in the Old West. Another legend says that Allison put Kennedy's head in a sack and took it to Cimarron, 29 miles away. Then he staked Kennedy's head on the fence in front of the Lambert Inn, which is now the St. James Hotel. It would stay there until it mummified and finally just disappeared one night. Again, that's a legend, and it seems pretty fantastical, so I'm not sure that I believe that that happened. Historians say that this story can't be possibly true because the Lambert Inn was not built until 1872, and Kennedy died 2 years before that. But Fred Lambert was operating a saloon in Elizabethtown in 1870, so it's very possible that Kennedy's head was staked in front of the Lambert Saloon in E-Town, rather than the Lambert Inn in Cimarron. For about 5 years after Charles Kennedy was executed by vigilantes, Elizabethtown prospered. It was known as one of New Mexico's most important towns, but as mining operations began to diminish and mining costs began to outweigh the volume of ore produced, people began to look for greener pastures elsewhere. The town lost its county seat status to Cimarron in 1872, when less than 100 residents remained in Elizabethtown. Cimarron would eventually hand the title of Colfax County seat to Raton in 1936. In 1875, Elizabethtown was reduced to a ghost town. The once bustling streets were empty, as were most of the buildings. Then, in November 1878, the Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe Railroad built more track between Trinidad, Colorado, and New Mexico, making it cheaper to transport ore. The mines opened back up in Elizabethtown, and again, there was prosperity. But that prosperity was short-lived. In 1903, a fire broke out in the Remsburg store and quickly spread through the entire town. Between the ore drying up and the fire, the town was again doomed. By 1917, the mines were no longer profitable. Investors fell into bankruptcy and the townspeople moved away. Most of them just abandoned their homes since nobody wanted to buy them. Today, there's not much left of Elizabethtown. The churches have fallen victim to vandals and time. Old trucks and farm machinery litter the land. The Mutz Hotel, once a grand structure made of stone and beautiful arched windows, is now just a few low walls. Most of the ornate stone walls lie scattered in the dirt where the hotel once stood. Frohlich's store still stands, and a few other buildings are scattered around the property. Rumors of restoration circulated for the last 10 years, but as of August 2021, the museum is permanently closed, and the Frohlich store and property are for sale. The cemetery is about a mile from the ruins. Charles Kennedy's gravestone has long disappeared. It was taken from his grave long ago. But the story of New Mexico's first serial killer remains, and possibly the ghosts of Elizabethtown's prosperous past still reside in the ruins. Thanks for listening, and stay safe, New Mexico. Thanks for watching. Stay safe, New Mexico.